Just a quick story. Again, I'm very fortunate to have had so many great people accept the invitation, and everybody that's speaking today is fantastic. And I think, frankly, I wouldn't be in this position without Michael's support. So, quick story. I was putting the first grant in back in the Emory, when I was at Emory, and we were at Society for Neuroscience in San Diego. And I had just gotten to know Marone Bixen a little bit. Marone connected me with Michael. And I needed a letter of support from somebody to say, hey, I'll make sure this guy doesn't screw up this grant. And Michael was so kind, didn't know me from Adam. I'm just some random guy that got introduced to him. And Michael was like, hey, I'm staying down at this hotel. My flight leaves, but I'll wait if you can get here and I'll sign your letter. So I ran across town and just had a wonderful conversation. And ever since then, it's been great to really get to know Michael. And as you'll see, just really outstanding, amazing work that has led to where so many of us are. So thank you. And it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Many thanks for the kind introduction. And so now I'm the recommendation letter guy, right? So if you have any more letters, no, it was really great. We had a very nice discussion long ago already. But I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to follow what you're doing, and you're doing great work here, definitely. So first time in Michigan, I was quite happy when I saw the university. They have the colors of my football team, who are playing on Sunday morning at 7 a.m. So if we don't talk now about early and late chronotypes. I want to shift the topics a bit. We heard a lot about the relevance of neuroplasticity, of strengthening or diminishing the strength of connections between neurons to modify functions. And I want to talk a bit today about a combination of non-invasive brain stimulation techniques to induce and stabilize oscillatory brain activity. So light switch, but things are connected. And now it's frozen, or I'm too stupid.
No. Are you pressing down? Try now.
Yes, great. Many thanks. So it's the conflicts of interest. And I won't talk about companies today, of course. And so when you look at the physiological correlates of behavioral processes and cognitive processes. You saw this already. You have external stimuli, and brain physiology is of central importance to induce cognitive, emotional, motivational processes, and then to translate at the end what you perceive to behavior. And Minfang has already shown you here. This is motor learning activation in the PET scanner. Changes of excitability during motor learning. And this here, working memory, and shows changes of oscillatory activity during working memory performance. And you see here, I will show later more details, that there's an enhancement of theta activity at certain stages of working memory performance. So beyond plasticity, also this oscillatory activity is quite important. And here are some more examples. So that's also more or less classical working memory task where people have to remind, here's the letters, and then they are asked, is the letter you will see next identical with your second last letter? So you have to remind this. You see after presentation of the previous stimuli, you see it during the maintenance phase, you have certain oscillatory activity, and here theta activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortex are quite important. And Rafael Polania, when he was working in our laboratory as a PhD student, he was an engineer and was quite interested in machine learning already relatively early, so it's more than 10 years ago now. And he analyzed EEG activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortex and tried to predict what answer the subjects will give if letters were identical or not, dependent on the oscillatory activity. And what he saw is that in the gamma frequency range, certain gamma frequency subranges were quite well in predicting the respective answers people gave. So you can get a lot of information from this oscillatory activity. So then the question, if it's so important, how can we enhance specific cerebral oscillations? And then, of course, because I'm a brain stimulation guy, so here I talk about non-invasive brain stimulation, and I will show you a bit. So if I would have asked you before, everybody or most of the people would have said, okay, that's TACS or something like this. It's not only TACS. So you can modulate oscillatory activity also with direct current stimulation. Of course, with TACS, tRNS is also techniques which was introduced to induce random oscillations, but it's now used more as a plasticity-inducing techniques. And with CS, there are also some data. I will concentrate a bit on TDCS and TACS now for the next minutes. And what was shown for TDCS also relatively early, so it came up in the 1998, 2000, and so on. And only a short time afterwards, there were two studies which showed here, study from the Italian group, it was Alberto Priori's group, showing that with cathode stimulation, there's enhancement of low frequency oscillations in the delta and the theta range. It didn't see any changes of oscillations in the high frequency ranges, alpha, beta, and gamma ranges. And Andrea Antar did a study where she showed a bit different results, but we had difference. Those who are in the field know that we had different electrode positions and all of these things and worked with different protocols. If you know all about the huge parameter space, she showed a reduction of high frequency activity with cathode stimulation and trend-wise alterations of anode stimulation. So also with TDCS, you have an alteration of oscillatory brain activity. So it's not only about plasticity. Rafael Polanyi, again, also relatively early already, showed that there's a specific alteration of oscillatory activity induced by TDCS, specific for task performance. Here we did motor cortex stimulation, and so it was a very simple motor task. This was finger tapping, and we compared resting conditions in the EEG with EEG after finger tapping performance under TDCS or sham stimulation. What you see here, that under resting condition is very small. You don't see much, but there is not much under resting condition, what we see. So not much specific effect. But what you see here is quite more interesting. So when we compare EEG before and after TDCS with finger tapping, you can see here that the finger tapping induces larger network activity after TDCS. So seeing this is impressive. So, but you could, of course, ask, is this due to TDCS or is this due to because it's repetitive finger tapping? If you do this a second time, this could also induce more connectivity. And so we contrasted here finger tapping after TDCS, real TDCS, with the anode over the motor cortex versus sham stimulation, and to see a bit less. But then this effect is, of course, must be due to TDCS. The important thing here is, however, that when you look at the pattern, it's the type of connectivity you see, and this is quite similar. So, which means that what you do with TDCS here, you enhance task-dependent oscillatory activity. You don't induce some random activity, but this really depends on the pattern. Is quite similar in that you induce by task performance. And so since some years, people are talking about functional specificity of the effects and functional focality and so on. And that's, in a way, that's a basis for this. It's the physiological effects are not completely unspecific, random, but when you do a task during stimulation, then you get these specific effects at the end of the day. And it was also shown for oscillatory TDCS, so this is still not alternating current stimulation, a very early study also. So now it's more or less exactly 20 years ago, as I did delta oscillatory stimulation. And what Marshall and colleagues showed was they could synchronize this delta activity during sleep via delta stimulation during sleep. And this was for low frequency activity. There was a synchronization and enhancement also for slow spindle activities in the prefrontal cortex, where they had also the electrodes. The important thing here, my talk is more mechanistically now, but they showed that this was combined with enhanced memory consolidation during sleep. So also here, you see an enhancement of oscillatory activity, relatively specific, and you see a performance improvement. So you have some effect of oscillations with TDCS. The question is, of course, if you want to have a specific oscillatory alteration, because TDCS is not specific by itself for specific frequencies, it enhances or reduces what is there. You might think about TSCS. So this is oscillatory activity alteration, also with low intensities of stimulation, with sinusoidal stimuli. First study by Andrea Antal and colleagues conducted in Göttingen. And what they had shown is that in difference to TDCS with these standard protocols, they didn't see any alteration of cortical excitability. So there was not much at the end of the day. What, however, was shown also relatively early is this didn't mean that the stimulation was ineffective or something like this. Here, Helfrich and colleagues did alpha frequency stimulation of the occipital cortex and compared this with sham stimulation. And you can see here that also under sham stimulation, there's enhancement of alpha, but this under real stimulation, you can see much larger effects, and these effects were stable in some studies up to an hour after the end of stimulation. So it's also clear that here under sham stimulation, if you think about what people are doing, they're sitting in a chair. We are famous for our boring experiments. So they're sitting there for 1 hour or longer, you do EEGs, and there's a bit of this oscillatory stimulation, and you're not allowed to fall asleep. But of course, you're extremely bored, and you all know that alpha activity increases when you are bored. And this is what you're seeing here. But this is increased. I think they didn't ask if people were more bored under real stimulation, but I think this is a pure physiological effect at the end of the day. It's a study conducted by Miles Wisniewski in our laboratory some times ago, and he did stimulation in the data frequency range. We were interested in about the mechanism of the physiological effects we see, and we combined in this study beta frequency stimulation with medication with dextromethorphan or placebo medication. Dextromethorphan, if you remember, is this NMDA receptor antagonist. So we wanted to know, are the effects dependent on NMDA receptors? I don't know if you know this substance. So it's an anti-cuffing agent at the end of the day. So it's don't know if it's here available. It's Vic Medinite or Vic Daymate or something like this. It says all dextromethorphan, and it's really efficient in reducing activity of NMDA receptors. So if you have an exam next day, maybe better don't take these drugs then, because this really reduces plasticity at the end of the day. Okay, so we look then for oscillatory activity alterations after the interventions. So by EEG, we did also TMS to explore if we see also some neuroplastic alterations. And what he showed, this was also 4x1 electrode montage with 2 milliamp peak to baseline, so it's a relatively high intensity. What we saw was that there's an enhancement of beta frequency activity after this beta frequency stimulation, which lasted for roughly 1 hour at least after the end of stimulation. Nothing under dextromethorphan. So dextromethorphan was quite effective to abolish these effects. So these effects depend on the glutamatergic system somehow. And we saw also some network enhancement between central and parietal electrodes. Not so many, because we have this small electrode and the other electrode with antagonistic polarity surrounding it, so you wouldn't expect much network alterations at the end of the day. What we saw also, however, was an enhancement of cortical excitability over the motor cortex, lasting also about for 1 hour, which was also dependent on the glutamatergic system abolished via dextrometaphone. So we see an alteration of oscillations via prolonged TSCS. We see here frequency, specificity of the effects. We don't see so much with TSCS. Enhancement of synchronization with neighbored areas, which is important when you think about cognitive performance. However, with this electrode arrangement, relatively regional effects, and we see additional neuroplastic effects. And this was new that these effects depended on the glutamatergic system. So the question is, you have the small electrodes, and why do you get those relatively large effects? And in Flavio Fröhlich labs, they did some modeling studies and animal studies in ferrets. And what they have shown is, I don't want to go through all the details here, but you can see here, so you initiate this oscillatory stimulation in a relatively tiny region, and then this oscillatory activity spreads. And this might be a specificity also of this oscillatory activity. This spreads and it's perpetuated via communication between neurons. And then after a while, you see this oscillatory activity in larger regions here, of course. And this was not only based on modeling, but this was also shown in ferrets afterwards. So to put these things together now, TSCS modulates oscillatory activity, as I've shown, but it is not frequency specific. TSCS entrains oscillatory cortical activity. So it doesn't itself, this is relatively low intensity stimulation. So if there's no oscillations active in a specific frequency band, you won't induce it because you don't initiate action potential. So that's the same with TDCS. So you need something to start with. So you need oscillations in a certain frequency to enhance these oscillations. So both have modulatory effects, but not inducing effects. And for most frequencies, neuroplasticity is not induced, but you saw with this beta frequency stimulation, and Walter Paulus also developed some stimulation protocols where they did stimulations at kilohertz frequency. And then you can, with specific stimulation protocols, you can induce also plasticity. Okay, so it's, however, not only electrical stimulation, which alters oscillatory activity, but you can induce such alterations also with transcranial magnetic stimulation, which differs qualitatively from these electrical stimulation protocols because it induces a much stronger electrical field, and so it induces action potentials, which means it can induce oscillatory activity. And that's a study by Tut and colleagues. This was published in 2011. So it's not only new studies. You will see some new studies later. So they stimulated the posterior parietal occipital region in the alpha frequency range. So they did 10 Hertz stimulation, had a couple of control conditions here. This was the alpha frequency protocol. And they did this with the coil position 90 degrees flipped. It did an arrhythmic alpha frequency stimulation inside the sham stimulation. And what you can see here and also here, it says enhancement of alpha activity. And this is there immediately after the stimulation already. This is a difference between these control conditions and the principal experimental conditions. And you can see that there's also a difference also in the early phase. The biggest difference is, of course, as compared to the sham stimulation. And you look here at the later phase after stimulation, so we are talking about 1-2 minutes or so, it's not much longer afterwards, but you can see here more specific effects. And at the beginning, when you think about what you do with TMS, you have also the click, the sound of the coil, and so on. So you have also unspecific effects, and also with these different TMS protocols, you have partially these unspecific effects. These are no longer here, there. And then you see more specific effects over the stimulated region. And you can see similar effects also with beta frequency stimulation, studied by Veniero and colleagues, and simulated with 20 Hertz. With RTMS, did it repetitively. And then you can see here an enhancement within the stimulated region, relatively short lasting again. You can see this here also. And interestingly, You see this stimulated in the beta frequency range, you see it here, but you see this also in the alpha frequency range. So it was not completely specific here for stimulation of a certain frequency. So when we are thinking now about how we can induce oscillatory activity in the brain, and how when we are thinking about clinical applications, what we want to have at the end of the day are long-lasting alterations of oscillatory activity, and you would be maybe also happy if you could induce time oscillations. If you're thinking a specific oscillation is critical for certain cognitive functions, then you don't want to depend on the spontaneous activity which is going on there. So you want to be able to induce it and you want to stabilize it. And so when you think about TSS and RTMS, they have complementary aspects here. So with TSS, you entrain, but you don't induce oscillatory activity, which you do with RTMS. TSS is critically dependent on spontaneous activity. RTMS is roughly independent from it because you induce by induction of action potentials its oscillatory activity. You have this frequency specificity with TSS, not so much maybe with RTMS, and you get long-term after effects with TSS, but not so long-lasting after effects with RTMS so far. Sorry. So the question is, what can you do? So can you combine these stimulation techniques? And this is what I want to show you, because this is what we have done in the last years, and did a couple of studies about this. So the idea was to induce oscillatory activity with a specific frequency with RTMS, to combine this then with TSS, and via this combination via TSS to stabilize this activity. We did bifrontal stimulation here, combining TMS and TSS. So we had these two coils and then two electrodes under it. Modeling shows that we are activating these areas, and we had of course different conditions here. So this was our first study. This was alpha TSS. So we combined TMS during the peak of the sinusoidal wave, or of TSS, the TSS alone. RTMS alone had a sham condition. And it's in control conditions where we compared peak stimulation with stimulation during the trough to see if this was specific here. And what we indeed showed was this combination enhanced activity at 10 Hertz. So this was the induced frequency. When we did it at the peaks, this was with eyes open and with eyes closed during the intervention. In both conditions, the alpha frequency activity was enhanced, and we had minor effects with RTMS alone, but this was much larger. And when you look here, it's the duration of the effects. The effects were at least stable for about 30 minutes, and they were relatively specific for the frequency you stimulated with. So you get a stabilization of the specific frequency you stimulated with here. And when you look at the EEG then at the whole brain, you see roughly the same. So you had an effect, a clear effect when you did TMS during the peak of the sinusoidal TSS-induced waves, not so much with the other conditions. This is under eyes open, eyes closed condition. And when you contrast here active versus sham, you see quite a similar effect. Interestingly, the effect was not only in the prefrontal cortex, but we did some other evaluations of our results. So this was strengthening frontal parietal connections, which make also sense if you think about these connections during work and memory performance, for example. We did then the same for the theta frequency. I think I'm running a bit out of time. So that's the same principle we did here. Yeah? So we stimulated during the peak. TMS during the peak of the TSS wave had also all the control conditions. Had a specific additional condition where we had during the peak of the TSS wave 80 Hertz RTMS, because it's known that there's this theta gamma conjunction during working memory performance. And it did not only obtain physiological results, but did in one experiment also explore the effects of our stimulation working memory performance. And what you can see here is effects were quite similar on physiology. So TSAS combined with RTMS during the peak had the best effects. And you can see this here also again. And also when we did the 80 hertz gamma stimulation at the peak of the TSAS wave, but the effects with 80 hertz was not relevantly stronger. When we looked at the performance of the N-letter back task, so quite similar to what I showed you at the beginning, what Raphael did with his working memory task, you can see here that there were an improvement of performance only for the three back tasks, and back tasks, nothing happened. And here, this combination of RTMS with TSS had the best effects here. So there was a functional effect. We know this letter back task quite well. So we have mainly young healthy subjects, and one back is not really tricky. So is the letter you see now the same as the last one? So this is if you're 20 years old and hadn't partied too much the last night, you're at your peak performance level. Three back is a bit more difficult. So you have more room for improving performance. And we see this also for TDCS, for example, when you do this. Okay, so I was talking now about young people, and the question might be what has this to do with aging and so on. And one thing it has to do with aging, you might be aware of there's some TSCS studies from Reinhardt and Guyen, for example, who did theta and also high frequency stimulation, improved in elderly cognitive performance via this stimulation. The interesting thing on what they did was that they individualized the stimulation frequency on the spontaneous stimulation frequency of the elderly. And what we would be interesting with what we did, what I showed you before, if you induce and stabilize this activity, do you need this individualization? Yeah, or can you say then, okay, we have our standard protocol, induce and stabilize, then you don't critically depend on this, which might make sense a bit more easily feasible in, let's say, clinical reality than just to identify the predominant frequency in the theta frequency range. What we do here now currently in an EU project, and this is more related to elderly directly, is that we are aiming, and we aimed in first study I will show you, to enhance gamma frequency activity. And there for Alzheimer's disease and also for aging people, there's an ongoing discussion that for not completely known reasons, stimulation in the gamma range, and this is not only electrical or magnetic stimulation, but also auditory and so on, can improve their symptoms. As there are some molecular changes people are seeing, not quite clear why. But one reason why this might be the case is that gamma frequency stimulation activates GABAergic neurons. Also, GABAergic neurons are declining in activity, and in Alzheimer's disease, you might also know that the problem might be that's the dynamic of the disease, and they are young, they have glutamatergic overactivity, and this might contribute to the cognitive decline you have later to excitotoxicity effects. And so enhancement of GABAergic activity might be helpful. So we did here the same. So we combined TMS with TSS. This is under open eyes closed condition, had control conditions, and so on. This is in our first study with young subjects. We are doing this now in the elderly. The somewhat unexpected effect initially was that the combination of RTMS with TSS didn't have the best effects here. So what you can see here is that TSS alone had the best and also long-lasting effects for 90 to 120 minutes as compared to the other conditions, so sham conditions and ITVs and so on. We did this with 40 hertz. We had a better effects of TSCS than of the combination. And of course, then we took our working memory class and to evaluate which effect we had here. And what we saw here is that ITBS and TSCS had improving effects on reaction time in this working memory class, but none of the other protocols had improving effects. So both seem to be promising. TSCS here with 40 Hertz might be a bit more in the oscillatory range. With ITBS, this could be, you all know this, could be also due to plasticity, not necessarily to oscillatory activity. This is something we are further exploring. And you see here the same. So the largest and most prominent effects we have here with TSCS and also with ITBS. And we are now doing additional studies. We try to convert this now to treatment of the elderly. So studies are ongoing, and clinical studies. So these are only single session procedures. But the clinical studies has started, where stimulation is conducted over weeks, and where the clinical effects are more in the forefront. Then, okay. So you see also that cognitive effects align nicely with the physiological effects we have. Okay, so to conclude, what I've shown you is that TSCS modulates but does not induce oscillatory activity. RTMS might induce oscillatory activity. The combination with TSCS and RTMS can have superior effects. We have also not only physiological but also functional effects when task-specific frequencies are enhanced. We modulate also functional connectivity. And so far, and I think that's a general drawback currently with TSCS, we don't have a large number of clinical studies. So this is a largely open field, but I think it's promising, and we shouldn't forget about this oscillatory activity at the end of the day. Okay, so that's a group, or this was a group before Corona. Now it looks a bit different, and we have 4 docs in our department now, which are not here. These are all the people who are doing the work. Many thanks for your attention.
Questions? Welcome.
So,
In higher frequency,
yeah.
how do you control for muscle activity?
Yeah. So the question was how much we control for muscle activity when we stimulate with higher frequencies, right? So, I mean, for TSCS, you don't induce muscle activity, and for TMS, we use stimulation intensities which are sub-threshold at the level of muscle contractions or anything like this. It's a region of at the level of the brain. Of course, they are sub-threshold because these are very short stimuli. And if they wouldn't activate neurons, you wouldn't expect any effect. So you need to elicit action potentials, but only eliciting action potentials does not necessarily induce muscle activity. So these are all relatively weak interventions.
But when you report to EEG, you have a lot of muscle activity, and the frequency is about 20 hertz.
What I've shown you here is EEG before and after the stimulation. So that's absolutely, of course. Yeah. So you have lots of muscle activity, but to have disaster, we don't need even TMS because of this TSCS. Of course, you will have all the TSCS effects you will have then in the EEG, and you won't be able to detect then physiological EEG activities.
And I just had one potentially unfair question, but it is something I've grappled with. So let's say that we do gamma frequency because that could be good for, say, working memory. Is there an unexpected cost if we amp that up on other cognitive tasks or other functional abilities? Could we have unintended consequences if we're just ramping it up indiscriminately?
Yeah. So the question was if there are drawbacks of simulation at certain frequencies when you enhance even performance in specific tasks if you might reduce performance in other tasks. I know this is a long-standing discussion, and if you let people then conduct a task where it's known that gamma frequency stimulation worsens it, then I would be surprised if it wasn't worsen it. But you won't have enhanced gamma activity or whatever for all the time over the whole brain and something like this. And what I've shown you for TDCS was that we had the task-specific effects of oscillatory activity. And the brain is also dynamic. So if something is not useful, and you have this oscillatory activity induced, and you do a task where beta frequency activity is important or whatever, this beta frequency will be much stronger, and this will be also counteract. So I don't believe in this dogma when you improve something, you necessarily have to make something different first, because the brain is dynamic. And it's not like you have, 100 milligrams of cognitive performance, and if you put 80 milligrams to working memory, 20 milligrams are not enough for attention. I think it's more complex.
Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you.